Hello, social circle. I had to do this impromptu live because I saw someone in the group posting about wanting to start her own podcast, and I had this rush of feelings about it. And actually, it's something Jason and I discussed earlier today, and I told him my feelings about. So I thought, what better time to come on and talk about it live than right now? There's no time like the present, right? So I will wait just a minute as people sort of get on, since this was a little impromptu and out of the blue. Hopefully folks will be able to join us live. If you're here, say hi. I would love to know who's here with us. So I want to talk about starting your own podcast from the perspective of someone who's had their own podcast. I did a podcast with my husband for, I think, close to 2 years. Hi, Emily. So this is totally for Emily, but I know there's other people in this group who have talked recently about wanting to start their own podcast. So I know there are other people out there, and whether you're thinking about doing it right this minute or it's sort of a long-term goal that you have, I have learned a lot about having your own podcast, both from having my own. Like I said, I had my own podcast with my husband for a couple of years. For those of you who don't know, I was a sports business reporter, and my husband is a college football reporter. And so we had and at the time, actually, he was a radio host. And so we had a podcast about the business of sports for the better part of 2 years. So some of what I'm going to tell you comes from my own experience hosting a podcast, and then the rest of it comes from the fact that I help 2 of my clients run their podcasts. So for those clients, I help book their guests, both going out and finding great guests for their audience, but also screening pitches that we get from people who want to be a guest on the podcast. And I've learned some best practices along the way. I figured out some of what does and doesn't work behind the scenes. And I have a pretty good idea of the things you need to have in place before you start and the team you need to have in place if you really want it to run seamlessly. Because starting a podcast sounds like a great idea, but it is a lot of work. I promise, if you have not ever had a podcast before, you have no idea how much work it is. Now, that's not to say that it's not worth it, and I'm not here to discourage you and tell you not to do it, because I think that it can be great for you. But I will tell you, I'm not unbiased about this. I've had a podcast of my own, and what I decided for me, what was right for me, is that I get far more out of being a guest on other people's podcasts than I ever got out of having my own podcast. So I'm going to share with you what that experience was like. Brooke says hi. Oh, Brooke was meditating with Deidre during my live. Well, I mean, I wouldn't take you away from that. I've heard Deidre is phenomenal, and I'm sure you got a lot out of that. So I will forgive you just this once. I will assume you watched the replay, or that you're going to later. So that live I did earlier today was about being a guest on podcasts. But tonight I wanted to jump on and talk about starting your own podcast, because I've seen several people in the group talk about wanting to start their own podcast. And I just saw Emily post about wanting to start her own. And I thought it sounded like an awesome idea. She talked about starting a podcast where she would interview self-published authors about their books. And I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, and as soon as she posted that, I knew, like, I have to do it right now. That's how I feel about Facebook Lives. For me to get on here and like have all this energy and like share all this information and value with you guys, I have to be like super pumped and passionate about it in the moment. And that's why I'm not good at being like, today I'm gonna go live at 2 p.m. Because I just jump on live when I have that sort of passion and that excitement to talk about something. So I'll start with my experience hosting my own podcast. The number one reason I don't have a podcast anymore is just the amount of time it takes. So it's not just, the hour or whatever that you're going to be recording, whether that's every week or however often you decide to do that. I actually have one of my clients who I help her book guests for her podcast. She wanted to book all of her podcasts for 2017, all the interviews in the first quarter of the year. So she wanted to record all of her interviews for the entire year, the first 3 months of the year. So we did this huge push in December and the beginning of January to get her all the guests she would need for the entire year. It was a huge undertaking. We actually suspended like all of her other publicity services under our retainer and just focused on getting her awesome guests for her podcast. So, but think about that. Like, she wasn't doing that herself. She doesn't have time to be booking all those guests and scheduling all those interviews. So even if you have a scheduler, which cuts some of the time out for you, you're able to just send people the link and let them schedule. That's not all the time that it takes, okay? So let me walk you through how it works for this client. And it's no secret who it is. She and I talk all the time about working together. She is unfortunately not in this group, but her name is Amanda Goldman Petrie, and she has a podcast called Market Like a Nerd, and started her podcast last July. I think I'm correct about that, because it was about the same time I started working with her that she decided to start her own podcast. And in the beginning, I didn't work on her podcast at all. Actually, that was not something I offered as part of my retainer services to my clients until she asked me to start doing it. And now that I've had the experience with her, I do offer it to my other clients, and just started doing it with another client, Kelly Youngs of She Is Fierce, whose podcast is just getting ready to launch. So that's been exciting because we've been working on the launch. So I'm definitely not here to tell you not to have a podcast, but I'm going to tell you exactly what it looks like behind the scenes of Amanda's podcast, how many of us are working on it, how the process works, and all the things we had in place. Because when Kelly came to me and said she wanted to start her podcast when we started working together, I said, okay, look, if anyone has this down to a science, it's my client Amanda. She is like the master of like standard operating procedures. She puts together all these documents and videos for it, and she has a huge team, and she's all about delegating and like more systems oriented than anyone I've ever worked with in my entire life. And so she really does have it down to a science more than anyone I know. And we sort of used her model to create Kelly's model. But I want you to understand that the people I know who do this and are successful at it and stick with it, because a lot of people start podcasts and go like a couple of months and then stop. And that's why when I'm booking people as guests on podcasts, I check to see how long has the podcast been around. If they say they're once a week, do they really post once a week? That sort of thing, because you'd be amazed at how many podcasts you find that that's not the case, because they got started and they realized how much work it was and they fell out of love with it pretty quickly. So what I want you to know before you start a podcast is what you're getting into. Again, I am not telling you not to do it. I just want you to know what you're getting into and the type of systems you could put in place to make it really easy for you and make it so it's not a huge time drain for you. Okay. And I know we've got several podcasters in this group too. I had a call with Mike recently about his vegan podcast, which Jason was a guest on, and I have a client that I want to get as a guest on there. So I know we've got some podcasters in here, and hopefully they can give you their opinions about having their own podcast. But here's how my client Amanda's system works that I think is about as efficient as you can get for running a podcast. So I, as her publicist, maintain a mailbox she has on her server that is just for media inquiries. And we also direct people from the website if they want to invite her to be a guest on their podcast, or if they want to pitch themselves for her podcast, to send a pitch to that inbox. So I actually have my own like email address on her server separate from my business's email. And I check that a couple of times a week, and I read through all the pitches we get. I know Alexandra here in the group pitched for that podcast, and it was fun to see somebody from our group pitching for my client's podcast, and I was able to give her some pointers about pitching herself in the future. But I go through all of those requests, okay? So Amanda, who's the podcast host, she's not doing that, okay? I'm going through them. I know what kind of guests she looks for and whether they fit or not. And if I think it's like I'm not really sure if they're a good guest, I'll forward it to her and get her opinion. But for the most part, I'm actually making a lot of those decisions about who's coming on the show and who isn't. I've worked on it long enough. I know exactly what she likes to have on. She only does case studies now on her podcast. And so if they haven't pitched a case study, but they sound like somebody who would be interesting or would have a great case study, I email them back. I let them know what our format is and to please resubmit their pitch and let me know what their case study would be. I also reach out to people on her behalf. So she might run into somebody in a Facebook group and say, hey, I really want this person to be on the show. Can you get them on? And she's given me really big names to go after. I know we've booked Nathan Chan, Neil Patel, JP Sears, some really big people, at least in her space, to have on the podcast. So I was also pitching those people. So as far as lining up guests for the show, sort of twofold for her. It's going through the pitches received from people, which would happen after your podcast had been up and running for a little while and people have started to discover it. And then also proactively reaching out to people that we want to have on the podcast, particularly people who have, you know, a big social media following or a big email newsletter list, who we know that by having them on the podcast, they're going to share that appearance and the podcast is going to get more listens. Because obviously if you're going to take the time to do a podcast, you want people to listen to it. So getting guests is sort of twofold in that manner. Okay. Once we've decided to have a guest on, whether that's someone we went to or someone who pitched us, I send them 3 things. Okay. And these are 3 things that I told my client Kelly, who's just now starting her podcast, to have in place before we start talking to guests. And that is a link to the scheduler. Okay, so that's easy enough. I think everybody would think of that. But also Amanda did a really good job of thinking forward and being proactive about the fact that she might want to use audio from these podcasts, maybe in other contexts and in different marketing and maybe in some of her programs. So she has everyone who's going to come on as a guest on the show sign a release for their audio so that she can use it in other formats. So I send them a link to the release to sign online. And then the third thing we send them is a form to fill out where they give us, you know, their name, what they want their title to be, their website, a bio, their headshot, a link to their free gift, and bullet points for what they're going to talk about. So that's all the stuff you need to sort of organize that person's appearance so that you can do the show notes. So it's not just, you know, jumping on and recording an interview and throwing it up. The podcasts that are very successful post show notes. Those vary from just a summary of the podcast, a link to the guest's website, their photo bio, a link to their free gift. I mean, that would be the kind of simple way to do it. Or I've seen people's show notes that are far more detailed than that, where they actually have someone who's gone through and given time markers. So like at 1 minute, 30 seconds, we talk about this. And at 9 minutes, we talk about this. And at 19 minutes, she said that, you know, so that if someone is looking for something specific in the podcast, they sort of know where in the podcast to jump. So that can be kind of varied as to how much time you put into that. But on the front end, to make sure we have all the stuff we need to be able to write the summary and get the show notes up, we have them fill out the form with all that information so that we're not chasing them after the interview. Okay, so I send them those 3 links: the calendar, the release form, and the info that kind of a questionnaire. Okay, so you gotta have all those things in place. My client Kelly, who's starting her podcast, we made sure she had all those things. So once we're ready to book a guest, I send them those links. Well, then there's a lot of follow-up, because here's what happens. People schedule their time and then they never sign the release and never fill out the form, or they fill out the form but they don't sign the release. So we just changed Amanda's system a little bit and we'll see how it goes. We made it so that they have to actually fill out the information form first, and then when they submit the form, then they get the scheduling link. I'll tell you what my concern with that is. It does sort of cut down on all the time I spend following up with people and chasing them around to get their information before their interview date, which can be really time consuming. But I'm also afraid, like, it tends to be now that when we tell people we want to book them for the show and we send them the link, they book like that. And then they come back to like the forms later. And that's why it takes a lot of chasing for the forms. I think that now that we're sending people the information form first, that they won't be able to do it right away and they'll put it to the side and we'll still be chasing them around and they won't have a date on the calendar. So we'll see. We're in sort of a trial phase for that. If there's anybody watching who has their own podcast and they found a great system, I would love to hear what it is, but that's what we're testing out right now. Okay, so you've got the person booked to come on and record with you. And I'm not even going into like the equipment and the software and stuff you need to have before you get started, because that is not my specialty. But you've got all that to think of. Okay, so now we've talked about how you book guests, all the things you need to have in place to get them scheduled and to get them the stuff that they need before the interview. Okay, then after the interview, first of all, you're probably going to find somebody who's going to do the editing for your podcast, who's going to polish it up, put in your intro, your bumper music, whatever you're going to have for that. You might have somebody who's helping you get it posted so that it goes to Stitcher and iTunes and all that sort of stuff. Emily says she's got the equipment already, so one thing down. Okay, so then after you do the interview, aside from the technical stuff you've got to do to actually get the audio ready to go live, you've got to follow back up with the guest. You've got to give them the date and the time that they're going to air. Most people will give you a graphic that you can use that's branded for the podcast and also has the guest's headshot somewhere on it and has their topic somewhere. And if you haven't seen examples of that, I can certainly post examples of ones I've had when I've been a guest on shows, but that's definitely a best practice. That's going to encourage people to share it on social media. So you're going to send them the image. You might even send them swipe copy to post with it. So you've got these things you're following up with them on. You're going to send all that once you know when their interview date's going to be. Then you're probably going to need to follow up with them again the day that it goes live. Remind them that it went live that day. Maybe share with them again the image and the swipe copy, because that's going to increase the odds that they promote you to their social media channels and on their email list. And you want them to do that because that's going to help you get listeners for your podcast. So it's very important that you have those follow-up steps in place as well. So I think sometimes when I talk to people about starting their own podcast, they're so excited to do it. They're only focused on like the 45 minutes or the hour it's going to take them to record the actual interview. But there's a lot of prep work that goes into getting guests, getting them ready, and then doing the actual interview, and then the follow-up that comes after that to help them promote the podcast appearance. And I'm not even getting into all the sort of technical needs as far as putting together the actual audio and making sure it sounds great and having the right equipment, or having somebody to help you edit it on the back end, and getting yourself in iTunes and Stitcher and all these other places. You know, that's all on top of what I'm telling you about. So I just wanted to share how much work it is and the sort of things I would think about before I started the podcast. I would have a system in place. I would figure out, are there people who are already on your team who can help you? Are there people you can hire who can help you? Because I think it would be incredibly difficult, and I say this from having done it myself, to host your podcast and do everything yourself, to book the guests, to do the interviews, to do all the editing, to get it, uploaded everywhere, to follow up with guests, send them their, create their graphics, send them their graphics, get them scheduled, all those things that happen that I just went through before and after the actual interview. To do all that by yourself. I mean, I hosted my podcast with my husband, so there were two of us, and we actually didn't even have guests on all that often. He hated having guests on. So he was on the radio all day dealing with like rabid sports fans. So the last thing he wanted to do was deal with them more. So a lot of times we didn't even necessarily have a guest, and it was still a ton of work. So I just want you to go into this eyes wide open and to have the proper systems in place. My client Kelly, who came to me, knew she wanted to start a podcast. She knew what the name was going to be. She had sort of a description of what the podcast would be. And she even had a list of guests that she wanted to have. And then I had to talk to her about getting the scheduler and having a form for people to fill out, so we got the right information and we got their bio and their headshot, all the stuff we would need to put together the show notes, and then the release to be able to use the audio in other places, which is maybe like overly cautious, but I'm an attorney, so I like to be overly cautious. And like I said, my one client was already doing that. And I thought it was such a great idea that now I've got all my clients who have podcasts doing it. And then thinking through who can help you with creating the graphic and getting people's interviews actually scheduled, following up to make sure people promo the episode, that kind of stuff. So I think it can be a ton of work. It's not for everyone. I don't want to discourage you from doing it. I'm all for there being more podcasts out there, because selfishly, that's more podcasts that I can pitch my clients for. But now that I have worked with two clients who have podcasts, and I've been part of the team who books and gets guests ready, I can tell you just how much work it really is. I want you to go into it set up to succeed. And I think that to be set up to succeed, you need to understand how much work it is, have a plan in place, have systems in place, and whether that's software and it's automated sort of stuff you've got behind the scenes, or it's having the right team members in place. I just want to make sure that you've set yourself up to have that sort of success with your podcast, so that you don't become one of those podcasts that's only on for a couple of months, and then when I look it up, you haven't done anything in 6 months because you've given up and realized how much work it was. I'd rather you just know up front and get all that stuff in place so that you can be successful from day one, because I've definitely had clients who've seen great success with their podcast, including my client Amanda, who I used as the example, who has all the systems in place, and those have evolved over time. She hasn't had all of them in place since the very beginning because she didn't know what to put in place, I don't think. But now that we've sort of gone through all of that, I think we have a really efficient system in place that's been working out really well for the podcast and for the rest of us who are on the team working on it. So if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. I know Emily is thinking about starting a podcast, and I love the idea she has for a podcast, which is focusing on self-published authors, letting them come on, maybe even read a chapter from their book and do their interview. I think that's such a great way to highlight so many of the awesome self-published authors that are out there, and I think that would be a really interesting podcast to listen to. Is there anybody else who joined us who either already has a podcast or is thinking about adding one to their business? I'd love to know what kind of podcast you have or what you're thinking about adding. And if you have any questions about sort of the behind the scenes work that happens with a couple of my clients whose podcasts that we work on, you guys know, if you've seen my lives, I'm a total open book. I will answer anything. I'll tell you about anything, unless it's something I think I have to ask my client for permission to share. But for the most part, my clients are pretty open about what they're doing too, and let me share about their businesses and their case studies and their results and that kind of thing. So there's some pretty awesome clients. I'm lucky in that way. I don't see a lot of questions, but I know a lot of you watched, which I'm so excited about. And if you didn't want to ask a question in front of everybody, you can send me a private message. Or if you think of a question later and didn't get a chance to post it here, you can post it here later, and I will come back and check the comments. I also know that this week I have been getting off my Facebook Lives and then seeing comments that I didn't see when I was live. So hopefully I'm not missing anybody's comments down there either. I don't see anything coming in. So I've got a client I actually need to pitch for a few magazine opportunities real fast before I kind of break for the evening. So if I don't see any questions, I'm going to go ahead and hop off and get to pitching. But I will come back and look for questions later, and we'll be happy to answer those. And if you're thinking about starting a podcast or you have one, I want to hear about it. I want to know what kind of podcast you're thinking about, or what kind of podcast you already have. Because if you already have a podcast, maybe I have a good client for you as a guest, or maybe somebody in the group is a great guest for you. Emily said I've given you a lot to think about. Okay, Emily's going to send me questions later. Perfect. If anybody else has questions, feel free to post those. I will come back and answer them. And if there's enough, I'm happy to do kind of a follow-up live and do more of it. But I've sort of given you everything I can think of from working with my clients that have podcasts. And I wish you luck. Have a great night, guys.